Now, let's continue with Katarina Strohmeier from the Austrian FMA. We are very pleased to have you here, Katarina. Stage is yours.
Many thanks. I'm really grateful to be here with you, with this amazing audience. And talk to you about the European ambitious AML CFT package, which is still under negotiations. However, for that, I will structure my presentation in 3 parts. So I give you a bit of an insight how the AML CFT architecture works on the example of Austria, where the limitations on the national prevention schemes, what the Commission proposes in order to tackle those limitations. And last but not least, I will give you some insight on the regulation of virtual asset service providers in Austria and the experience we have with them. So to tell you here, like most of the regulation on national level is driven by European legislation. So currently we are having the 5th AMLD directive implemented. A directive, lawyers know what I'm talking about. It's something that needs to be put in law again. So it's not set in stone. You need to implement it on the national level, which comes with its problems. Furthermore, a national regulation is also driven by recommendation by the FATF, which is an international action task force embedded in the OECD. But the FATF does thorough mutual evaluation and peer reviews of member states on an ongoing basis, really looking into the level of implementation of the recommendations and the country's system for the prevention of criminal abuse in the financial system. Further on, you have the coordination among other authorities. So here you can see you have criminal enforcement agencies, you have the financial intelligence unit. Obviously, you have several ministries that also come together in various settings. And only recently, due to a couple of scandals, I will call it, in the last decade, the European Union decided to give a mandate to the European Banking Authority in order to further steer convergence on the supervisory practices. But it's more like a coordination mandate to monitor, to give guidance, and bring all the national authorities together back on the table. As I said, the system has limitations, mostly because financial service operators operate internationally, actually quite a lot. The implementation of the given European directive framework is not implemented or very weakly implemented. And the supervisory interpretations and the law enforcement practices differ quite a lot. So that's why the Commission in 2020 came up with an action plan in order to address those limits, gaps, and loopholes. So it's more about effective implementation, create a single rule book, establish an EU supervision for AML CFT purposes, support not only the supervisory authorities, but also the financial intelligence units in that respect, and to ensure enforcement of criminal law provisions and the exchange of information. And something that quite lately also became more and more an issue, to put more emphasis on the international dimension of this framework. So only summer last year, the Commission then finally came up with a comprehensive package consisted out of 4 legislative texts that, and here's the big disclaimer, are still under negotiation with the co-legislators. but I will give you a bit of a flavor what are the main aspects of it, and maybe also where there's some progress achieved in the negotiations as such. So the key point is the harmonization of an EU single rulebook, meaning that it's not a directive. Thank you very much. It's not a directive, it's a regulation that's directly applicable to the member states. So it doesn't give any ambiguity on the interpretation side. That on the single rulebook mostly covers the scope and the addressees. So there's an expansion of the obliged entities that are addressed in the rulebook, which now extends not only to crowdfunding service providers, but also crypto asset service providers. Further on, there will be an extensive harmonization on the customer due diligence requirements, and on a group level also internal control and procedures. Here, just to name a few, when it comes to the identification or verification of the customer, the ongoing transaction monitoring for the customers, the outsourcing possibilities. So here the Commission is also emphasizing on the innovation aspect, to keep the regulation loose enough to allow for innovation. Then more specific terms for standardized, simplified, and enhanced customer due diligence. Then certain templates, for instance, for the suspicious transaction reporting obligations, and so on. Furthermore, and which is quite a bold step, is the establishment of an own EU AML authority, the so-called AMLA, which will not only coordinate the supervisory authorities, but also the national financial intelligence unit. They will bring, the AML regulation sets out the tasks and competences, but also gives clear guidance on how information exchange shall be undertaken and how various registers shall be made available among the authorities. And last but not least, there won't be any anonymous transfers allowed anymore. So with the implementation of the FATF travel rule, the transaction of crypto assets for crypto asset service providers will need to follow those requirements, but I will come back to that later. So, as I mentioned, the AMLA authority is a new authority, sort of like the European supervisory authorities, ESMA, EIOPA, or EBA, the European Banking Authority, which will have, contrary to those I mentioned, an executive board consisted of full-time members, this in order to provide some conflict of interest prevention towards the national authorities. And on top, it will have a general board consisting out of two separate compositions, one on the supervisory authority side and one on the financial financial intelligence unit, which is quite unique as a setup as such. Then the AMLA will have also clear direct supervision on certain financial sector operators. The criteria is currently still under discussion, but it will focus mainly on the cross-border dimension, however also on the AML risk profile of that entity. What we know now is that in the discussions there's also a focus on crypto asset service provider to be in the remit of that direct supervision. And indirectly, it will also support the financial supervisors, but also self-regulatory bodies on As an authority, the AMLA will also have ordering measure powers. They can impose sanctions and also can conduct on-site visits like the JSD within the ECB single supervisory mechanism. As mentioned before, they will also coordinate and support the work of the FIUs, but they will also build up a EU AML database currently established by the European Banking Authority and will coordinate the FIU network and various registers, such as the Ultimate Beneficial Owner Register and the National Account Register. There will some emergency delegation rights, but mostly the AMLA will focus on supplementing or complementing the single rulebook as such, so it will act as a regulator and will prepare regulatory technical standards, implementing technical standard drafts, guidelines, recommendation to the co-legislators. Yeah, and the fourth package will cover the transfer fund regulation, which has been prioritized with the MiCA for two purposes, because it cross-references to the MiCA in terms of the definition of the CASPs, but also it implements the FATF travel rule, meaning that any CASP must collect and keep information about the sender and recipient of a transaction. Therefore, no transaction is any transaction needs to be transparent. On top, there is also a requirement for an internal control and process mechanism to implement restrictive measures. And as I mentioned before, the TFR has been prioritized with the MiCA, so it means we expect entry into force by Q2 next year, which then gives us a transposition period of 18 months. And here we know already that EBA, which has been tasked with some mandates, will work on guidelines, in particular on risk factors, fund transfer, restrictive measures, and risk-based guidelines to be extended to the scope for CASPs. Yeah, how does the overall timeline look like? Again, this is the timeline proposed by the Commission, which was probably overly positive. In any case, what we can say is going to be delayed for a year, maybe more, I don't know. But we know that the agency that it's in plan will, at its full stake, have around 250 FTEs. There will be a level 1 methodology that will further develop the budgetary components of that. And there is a transposition period of 3 years, which will hopefully give enough time for EBA and the AMLA to draft all the empowerments for RTS, ITS, and guidelines. Yeah, I think I have a few minutes left. So to conclude, I will give you a bit of an update on what we've been doing as a financial market authority in Austria in regards to the regulation of VASPs. So since January 2020, any virtual asset service provider that offers activities from Austria or towards Austrian customers or the Austrian market requires a registration with the Financial Market Authority. The provision of services includes either the safeguard of private cryptographic keys, the exchange of virtual currencies into fiat or vice versa, the exchange of one or more virtual currencies between one another, the transfer of virtual currencies, and the provision of financial services for the issuance and selling of virtual currencies. with that experience, the FMA follows a zero-tolerance policy when it comes to virtual asset service provider. Why that? I'll give you a bit of an insight. So this is the current landscape provided in Austria. So we have a total of 21 VASPs registered. This is a database that is publicly available, so you can look it up at the FMA website. However, in total, we received around 68 applications for the past almost 2 years, with 22 applications withdrawn, about 4 rejected, 12 are still ongoing, and a total of 7 are revoked or either withdrawn due to supervisory findings. Yeah, having said that, my time is running out. What I can see is that we have quite some experience on the AML CFT side, on the crypto supervision. I can only stress the awareness is not that high as it is in the classical financial sector. Therefore, yeah, nothing more to add. I'm just saying, finally, we're very curious about MiCA. We're all gonna see how big the implications will be for the market players, but also for the regulators. It will definitely be a big challenge, especially for the simplified procedures that are foreseen. But how can I say? The devil always lies in the detail.
Fantastic job, Katarina. Thank you so much.